Blackwater Ben by William Durbin. Afterword. Imagine a 4-horse team harnessed in a tandem and hitched to a 30-foot-high sled load of logs weighing 140 ton. Sound impossible? On February 26, 1893, in northern Minnesota, 4 horses pulled such a load 3 miles to a landing, where it was later transported on 9 railroad flat cars to the World's Fair in Chicago. That single load scaled out a total of 36,055 board feet. Enough wood to build 10 modern homes. Over the years, true reports of such gargantuan feats mingled with tall tales, eventually leading to the creation of mythical figures such as Paul Bunyan and his companion Babe the Blue Ox. But where did Americans' storied lumberjack traditions begin? Logging has always played a central role in the history of America. Long before the American Revolution, scouts of British Royal Navy claimed New England's tallest and straightest trees in the name of the crown by blazing them with a broad arrow mark. A surveyor general of the King's Woods was appointed to protect these trees, some of which were more than 200 feet tall and perfect for a ship's masts, but it was impossible to stop the local citizens from cutting them down. Lumber was not only important for building farms, schools, churches in colonial America, but it was also exported in large quantities. Besides moving materials for shipbuilding and cabinet making, American lumber was used to manufacture heading and barrel staves. Hogsheads were shipped to the West Indies as molasses containers, while barrels were used to ship apples and potatoes. Wood and lime casks were also in great demand. Milled lumber was traded for gold, rum, and molasses throughout the Caribbean. Cuba used 40 million board feet of American lumber in a single year for sugar boxes. As settlers moved farther west, the forest was regarded as an impediment to a process. Trees were chopped, girdled, and burned down to make way for horses and houses and farms. Everyone assumed that the vast timber reserves were inexhaustible. However, by 1839, loggers had cut their way through pine stands of Maine, Michigan, Wisconsin, and arrived in Minnesota and then part of the Wisconsin Territory. Experienced lumbermen traveled from New England to start the first sawmill in the St. Croix River Valley, and within a decade, the community of Stillwater, Minnesota became the lumber milling center of the whole territory. As the demand for lumber increased, logging camps spread north toward the Canada border. By the 1860s, mills in Stillwater and Minneapolis had switched from circular saws to steam-powered bandsaws, and their increased efficiency allowed them to supply America's growing need for railroad ties and dimensional lumber. Minnesota's wood was soon being marketed from New York to Denver. In 1900, the peak year of white pine production in Minnesota, 20,000 men and 10,000 horses were employed at lumber camps in the North Woods, using only axes and crosscut saws to fell trees that were often too large for 2 men to reach around the middle. The lumberjacks harvested 2.3 billion board feet of timber. Enough pine was cut in 1900 alone to build 600,000 two-story homes. That lumber sawed into 1-foot-wide boards and placed end to end could have stretched all the way from the earth to the moon. Soon the white pine reserves, which had been regarded as endless, came to a sudden end. Trees were cut so rapidly that the timber production began to decrease as early as 1901. Yet the logging continued. The largest white pine sawmill in the world operated in Virginia, Minnesota, from 1910 to 1929. Every 24 hours, the Virginia Rainy Lake Company sawed 500,000 board feet of lumber, producing more than 2 billion board feet of lumber and lath in its 20-year life. But by 1930, the largest logging companies had left Minnesota and headed west, seeking richer stands of lumber. Yet the cutting of white pine still went on. Today, only 2% of the original 3.5 million acres of white pine remains. Except in remote areas such as the Boundary Waters Canoe Area, Wilderness, and the Chippewa National Forest Lost 40, north of Grand Rapids, Minnesota. Old-growth pine is extremely rare. Minnesota once had twice as much white pine as New Hampshire, but it presently has less than 1/20th as much. Attempts at reforestation have been complicated by white pine blister rust disease, deer feeding, and modern timbering, which relies on faster-growing species such as aspen. Groups such as the White Pine Society hope that the white pine can be restored, but their funding is limited. Despite these problems, people remain hopeful that with dedication and hard work, Minnesotans can one day help these 400-year-old crown jewels reclaim their rightful place in the forest. What was it like for the men who worked in the woods back in the lumberjack days? Though the normal load for the logging sleds wasn't as large as 140-ton show load that was put together for the World's Fair, 4-horse teams typically hauled 20 to 25 tons of wood at a time. The reason such enormous weight could be moved by horses was the system of ice roads that logging camps employed. When the roads were first swamped or cleared, the grade was carefully calculated to allow for mainly downhill pulls to the landings. Since logging was done only in the winter, a sled-mounted water tank iced the roads to give the runners maximum slippage, and a bull rudder cut grooves into the ice. As hard as the horses worked in the logging camps, the lumberjacks worked even harder. In fact, most logging camp foremen were concerned about the health of the horses than that of the jacks, who believed they could take anything. The jacks, who were infamously crabby fellows, tolerated bitterly cold temperatures and long hours in the woods, but demanded good food. No matter what the wages, jacks always asked who the cook was before they signed on in a camp. Lumberjacks ate an astonishing 5,000 to 6,000 calories per day. Once spring came, the logs were shipped to sawmills by rail car, or they were driven downriver when the ice went out. On the larger lakes, steamboats pulled huge booms of logs across the open water to railheads and mills. River drives usually began mid-April in Minnesota and lasted about 6 weeks. Lack of winter snow cover or spring rains could make it difficult or impossible to drive the logs to the mill. High water could also cause problems by allowing the logs to float over the riverbanks and become stranded. The men who rode the logs down the river were called river pigs. It took great skill and courage to balance on a log that could easily tip a man into freezing cold water. A flat-bottomed Wanigan boat, a combination floating cook shack, and a bunkhouse that would accommodate 20 men, accompanied the men down the river journey. Log jams presented the most dangerous obstacle to the river drives. It took great skill for a river pig to identify and remove a key log that would be holding back several million feet of lumber. Dynamite was sometimes used to break the logs free, but the job usually fell to a single man who walked out onto the jam and pried or pulled the key log loose. When the log jam broke, many a man was lost as he attempted to run across the crashing logs to the riverbank. Once the winter logging season was done and the drives were complete, loggers often squandered their wages on single weekend in town, while few of the more responsible men saved their money and invested in farms and other businesses. Jacks tended to live for the day and not give much thought to anything except getting back to the tar paper again when the next logging season started.